Hello everyone and welcome back to a new video on my channel. In this video I would like to talk about using the Canon EOS 2000D and the Canon EOS 6D for deep sky astrophotography. So I've been using both cameras multiple times over the last few years for astrophotography, and I've captured one of my best images so far with these two DSLR cameras. And in this video I would like to talk about both cameras, and I would like to compare both cameras step by step. So as you can see in the background, I've listed up different features that are important for me when planning to use a DSLR camera for astrophotography, and I'd like to compare both cameras in this video. After that, I would like to share some videos with you that I've captured with both cameras in deep sky astrophotography, and in the end I would like to talk about which of both cameras I would recommend for deep sky astrophotography. But now, let's get started. Before comparing both cameras, I would like to mention that this video is not sponsored, I'm not being paid for it, and all products shown in this video were purchased by myself. But now, let's get started. The first and sometimes most important aspect I would like to talk about is the sensor of both cameras. So in this case, there's a big difference between both cameras. The Canon EOS 2000D has an APS-C sensor, and that's a big difference. So not only due to the size of the sensor, but also due to the telescopes or lenses that you can use, because it's important to keep in mind that not all telescopes are suitable for full-frame cameras, and when using a full-frame camera in combination with a lens or a telescope that is not suitable for full-frame cameras, you will have problems in the end. For sure, you can also capture great images, but post-processing will be quite challenging for you. Therefore, I often recommend to use an APS-C sensor in combination with a telescope when your telescope is not suitable for full-frame cameras. For sure, if your telescope is suitable for full-frame cameras, definitely go for a full-frame camera. For sure, that depends on the field of view you would like to achieve in the end, but when planning to do wide-field astrophotography or when planning to use a DSLR camera for astrophotography, I would recommend using a full-frame camera if your telescope is suitable for these full-frame cameras. The next aspect I would like to talk about are the megapixels. So in this case, the Canon EOS 2000D has 24.1 megapixels and the Canon EOS 6D 20.2. So in this case, the difference is not that big. In astrophotography, it's not that important to have a lot of megapixels, so when comparing these DSLR cameras to these cooled dedicated astrophotography cameras, you will realize that most of these cameras do have less megapixels compared to these DSLR cameras. The next aspect is the ISO range. It's a quite important aspect as well, not that important. So the Canon EOS 2000D has an ISO range between 100 and 6400, but you can even use an ISO value of, I guess, 12,000 when upgrading the camera. So that is easily possible by just going into the settings of your DSLR camera. The Canon EOS 6D can use an ISO value of more than 100,000, which is often not necessary. So for astrophotography, I'm using an ISO value of 1,600 quite often when using these DSLR cameras, so both cameras are definitely in that range. The next aspect is manual mode. When using a DSLR camera for astrophotography, it's very important that your camera has a manual mode. Why is that important? Quite easy. If you're planning to capture images of the night sky, it's important to be able to use the camera settings yourself, because in the end you would like to control the exposure time, the ISO value and the aperture yourself, and that is important, and therefore you need the manual mode. The next one is live view mode. Live view mode means that you can see on your display what your camera is capturing right now. That's quite nice, especially for focusing. So if you're focusing on a bright star, which is something you have to do, then having live view mode can be very, very helpful, definitely. In this case, both cameras can do so, which is definitely quite good. The next aspect is RAW. It's very important that your DSLR camera can capture images in RAW. That is important because in post-processing, that allows you to process your images easier. And furthermore, when planning to stack multiple images, you have to capture these images in RAW because, for example, when stacking these images in Deep Sky Stacker, the images need to be in RAW. In this case, both cameras can do so, which is definitely quite good. The next aspect I would like to talk about is a connection for a remote shutter release cable. That's actually a very important aspect. So, first of all, both cameras do have a connection. When planning to use a DSLR camera for astrophotography, you have different options for controlling this camera. So on the one hand, you can use an astro computer like the CWO ASI Air Pro, or you can use your laptop. But when not using an Astro computer for controlling the DSLR camera, you have to control your camera with the buttons of your camera. And when planning to do deep sky astrophotography, you would like to capture multiple images because you are planning to achieve a relatively long total exposure time. And therefore, when not having a connection for a remote shutter release cable, you have to manually press on the button of your camera every time you plan to capture an image. And that is, of course, not that good. When using a remote shutter release cable, you can select the exposure time, the number of images you would like to capture, and then your camera is capturing multiple images all night long. Very helpful for astrophotography. Therefore, definitely make sure that your camera has a connection for a remote shutter release cable. In this case, both cameras do so. The next aspect is a flip screen. A flip screen can be a very helpful thing when planning to do deep sky astrophotography, because sometimes it's easier to focus on a bright star when having a flip screen, especially when capturing an object that is very high in the night sky. In this case, both cameras do not have a flip screen, but still you can do deep sky astrophotography with both cameras, but for sure having a flip screen can be very helpful. The next thing is bulb mode. Having a bulb mode is quite helpful for astrophotography because it allows you to capture longer exposure times than 30 seconds. In astrophotography, I often plan to use an exposure time of 3 to 5 minutes, and with bulb mode that is possible, but when not having a bulb mode, you're limited to the maximum exposure time of 30 seconds. For sure, you can also do deep sky astrophotography with a maximum exposure time of 30 seconds because you can stack multiple images in the end, but being able to capture a long exposure time is definitely great for astrophotography. When not using the bulb mode, the maximum exposure time of your DSLR camera is 30 seconds. The next aspect I would like to talk about is how heavy these DSLR cameras are. In this case, there's a difference between both cameras, but the difference is not that big. I'm often planning to mention that because some people are using a smaller telescope and a camera on a star tracker, for example, such as the Ioptron Skyguider Pro. But these star trackers are limited to a maximum payload capacity of 5 kilograms, and when using very heavy equipment on these star trackers, you will get star trails in the end, or generally speaking, the tracking will not be that good. And therefore, I often do not recommend to overload these star trackers, but in this case, both cameras are not that heavy, so definitely not a problem. When talking about the price, there is a difference between both cameras. I've bought the Canon EOS 2000D new for 350 euros, and I bought the Canon EOS 60A used for 350 euros as well. So there's a difference between both cameras. Now I would like to share some images with you that I've captured with these two DSLR cameras. So actually I started with the Canon EOS 2000D into the hobby of astrophotography. So this is the first image I would like to share with you of the Triangulum galaxy. It looks quite good, noise is quite noticeable, but when zooming in you can see that you'll have less noise compared to other DSLR cameras. And that is something I was not expecting in the beginning. So I was expecting to have more noise in my final results. So I was definitely quite surprised by how good this DSLR camera actually is. I've even captured the Orion Nebula using this camera. So when zooming in, so for example, when looking at this region, you can see that the signal to noise ratio is very, very good. This image, so the total exposure time of this image is not that long. So keep that in mind. So I was pretty surprised by how good this DSLR camera is. Another image I've captured is this image of the Pleiades star cluster. So this image has a total exposure time of less than an hour, so not that long. But still, the signal to noise ratio is definitely quite good in this case. Now let's go over to some images I've captured with the Canon EOS 60A, so the Astro modified version. I, for example, captured this image or with this camera, or I've even captured the Blue Horsehead Nebula. So this image, I've captured this image on La Palma. So the total exposure time is less than an hour, but still the signal to noise ratio is definitely pretty amazing, I guess. So definitely a very good camera for deep sky astrophotography. And I have even captured the North American Nebula using the Canon EOS 60A, which is this image. So much said about these different images I've captured. So in this case, I have to say that both cameras are very, very good. So in some comparisons, I often say this camera is better or this camera is better. But in this case, actually both cameras are very good. and I was surprised by both cameras when using them the very first time for deep sky astrophotography. So if your telescope is not suitable for full-frame cameras, I would go for the Canon EOS 2000D. If your telescope is suitable for full-frame cameras, I would rather go for the Canon EOS 60. So generally speaking, both cameras are very good and I can recommend both cameras for astrophotography, but if I had to pick one of these DSLR cameras, I would rather go for the Canon EOS 60 because I think the Canon EOS 60 has less noise compared to the 2000D, but the difference is not that big, so both cameras are very good for deep sky astrophotography. Something I would recommend when planning to buy one of these DSLR cameras, I would recommend to buy the Astro modified version of these cameras because these cameras are a bit better for astrophotography, so just keep that in mind. If you have any further questions about these DSLR cameras, definitely feel free to ask me down below in the comments and I will definitely help you. And if you have any other questions about other DSLR cameras, feel free to ask me as well. If this video was interesting and helpful to you, I would really appreciate a like and a subscription. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, clear skies, Felix.